Welcome to the Plato Paradigm, a paradigm shift in reading Plato's dialogues. Episode 183, IO 536, D to E. Socrates has gone to a lot of trouble to prove or to demonstrate or argue that when Io is at his best as a rhapsode, he is in fact not using a techne, he's not even using his understanding, but he is simply being possessed in some way by the god. He says the god, but also a muse, and the muse in this case would be Calliope. Given his investment in this argument, we might think that this is Plato's own view, if not Socrates' own view, and we might expect Io to say, yes, indeed, Socrates, that's a brilliant argument, and I'm completely persuaded. But this is what Io actually says. Sumen iu leges, O Socrates. On the one hand, Socrates, you speak well. Now, speaking well for Athenians in around the 4th century is to speak with some mastery of rhetoric. Io has already said earlier that he enjoys listening to people like you, Socrates. In other words, wise people who have learnt rhetoric. Io is not saying that he enjoys listening to dialecticians because he is unaware of dialectic, as are most people. He would regard the 4 analogies as examples of rhetoric, and indeed they don't seem to be dialectic at all. Someone already dialectically inclined would pick up on the inconsistencies among the analogies, but the 4 analogies together don't appear to be anything like a dialectical exercise. Io says that Socrates speaks well. In other words, he approves of the rhetoric. He has enjoyed the rhetoric. And this is from a rhapsode who tends to fall asleep whenever he hears any of his fellow rhapsodes discussing or declaiming any poet other than Homer. Why would a rhapsode enjoy listening to rhetoric? If we think about it, who does enjoy listening to rhetoric? The many, and the many do not have the techne of rhetoric. While Io may actually have the techne of rhapsody, he doesn't have the techne of rhetoric, and this is probably why he enjoys listening to rhetoric. So he enjoys rhetoric, but has the rhetoric done its job? The point of rhetoric is to persuade. Indeed, one of the first definitions of rhetoric in the ancient world is techne pethus, which is the art of persuasion. Thaumatzoi mimentan e hutos epois hosteme anapesai hos ego katechomenos kai mainomenos homeron epaino. I would be amazed, however, if you were to speak so well that you would persuade me that I praise Homer when I am possessed and mad. The words possessed and mad are both participles, and we may interpret them as because I am possessed and mad. This was the point of Socrates' argument, to show that Io is indeed possessed and mad, and that it is because of that that he praises Homer. Being possessed and mad are 2 aspects of the same thing. He simply lacks his own nous. It's been replaced by the divine power. Strictly speaking, then, it is the divine power itself which praises Homer. That is, that would be the case were it to be true, but Io himself doesn't believe it. Even Socrates hasn't managed to speak that well to convince Io that this is the case. Therefore, he's saying that Socrates' rhetoric is good, but not that good. We shouldn't think for one moment that Socrates is actually trying to convince Io of this. In a way, it's good that Io has reacted as he has. Oimaide udan soi doxaimi emu accusais legontos peri Homero. I think I wouldn't even seem to you if you were to hear me speaking about Homer. In other words, Io himself knows full well how much exercise and effort it has taken to become a good rhapsode on Homer. He has had to memorize thousands of lines, and he has had to learn how to deliver those lines. He would be right to consider this a techne. Incidentally, we may infer from what Io says here that he doesn't believe that Socrates has ever heard him perform, and this may be the case. It's not obvious. I would have thought that Socrates would have heard Io, but he would have been lost in the crowd and Io wouldn't have noticed. This is a very minor point in the dialogue, but even so, some people might say that I'm performing the documentary fallacy, taking whatever is said in the dialogue as if it reflects the historical reality. I'm not saying that the historical Socrates had to hear the historical Io. I'm just saying that from all of the indications in the dialogue itself, Socrates would have heard Io. Given that Io is often in Athens, he does perform in public places. Socrates himself doesn't push himself forward all the time. He would just listen in the audience. Even if Socrates hadn't heard Io, he would have heard many other rhapsodes, so he does know what rhapsody is about, and he would have a good idea of the way Io performs rhapsody. Io's point would be, therefore, that Socrates would know that Io has a techne were he to experience the techne, which is an interesting claim for a rhapsodist to make. The rhapsodist is declaiming all the time about things which are not historically true, which are not even realistic half the time. They are mythological, heroic, and divorced from reality. But when it comes to the techne of the rhapsodist knows that anyone experiencing that reality would be required to reach a particular conclusion. In this case, that Io has a techne. Socrates misinterprets what Io says as if Io is angling to get Socrates to ask him to give him a demonstration of his rhapsodic powers. Kaimen etheloge accusai, umentoi proteron prinan moi apokrine tode, and I do indeed wish to hear, but not before you answer me this. Hon Homeros lege peritinos iu leges. Of the things Homer says, about what do you speak well? So Socrates says he would like to hear a demonstration, but not yet. And instead of that, he wants to know on what subject Io speaks well. Speaking well is exactly what Io had said about Socrates, that Socrates speaks well. Not well enough, but he does speak well. He is almost persuasive, but not quite. When Socrates says that Io speaks well, or he's asking on what subject Io speaks well, he's not talking about the job of a rhapsode to speak expressively with all the arm movements and the pathos and bathos which goes with it. He's asking about a particular subject, and if you speak well on a particular subject, it means you are speaking truthfully about that subject. If you speak well about a subject, you have to be accurate about it. If you just lie about a subject, you are speaking badly about the subject. This, at least, is what they thought in the ancient world. Possibly not nowadays, but then that was the case. Even sophists know that you are supposed to appear to speak accurately and truthfully about a subject, even if you are not. That is to say, to speak well is to speak truthfully. Whether you are speaking truthfully or not, you want to appear to be speaking well. Here, Socrates isn't distinguishing between speaking well and appearing to speak well. He simply wants to know the content, which particular thing in Homeric poems is a subject about which Io at least claims to be able to speak well. We may already think for ourselves and come to some conclusions. To be able to speak accurately and truthfully about a subject, you must understand that subject for yourself. So if Homer speaks well about that subject, and you understand that subject, then and only then would you be speaking well about that subject. You and Homer need to be expert on a particular subject to be able to speak well about it. In that case, it would seem that Socrates is prepared to drop the argument that Io has no techne and no intelligence when he speaks about the best poems of Homer, or when he performs the best poems of Homer. He's prepared to accept that possibly on one or other subject, Io does actually have a techne or some intelligence, although this techne and this intelligence have nothing to do with Rhapsody itself. On which subject do you speak well? U garde puperi hapantonge, for obviously not about all of them. This is clearly a prompt to make Io declare that he is an expert on all of them, and he really does have to be an expert on all of them if he is to maintain his claim that he's the best rhapsode on Homer.